Zia, thank you. And that is the central message of today's press conference, that putting up taxes in this budget is a choice. It's a choice the Chancellor is going to choose to make in whatever form, in the end, they manifest themselves. What we do know is that an increasing tax burden is demotivating, is sending more and more people abroad. And I really worry, particularly about the number of sort of 30-something entrepreneurs, people like him, who are leaving the country because they just really fear and worry about the direction that we're going in. And once again, I want to reiterate, we as a party are proposing massive cuts in spending, and particularly massive cuts in welfare spending. And we're the first people really to have the courage in modern times to lay any of this out. Now, as ever, we will take our questions, beginning with our favourite broadcaster, the BBC, and Alex Forsyth.
Thank you very much. You are talking again today about some pretty big numbers, 25 billion. Can I just press you on the workability of some of what you've announced? You said you would stop foreign nationals claiming universal credit, including those with EU settled status. That's protected by the withdrawal agreement. What gives you any sense that the EU would renegotiate that agreement? And if you say you'd act unilaterally, have you done any analysis of the potential costs when it comes to possible retaliation by the EU, including on trade?
Well, firstly, on the point, on numbers, the last accurate figures we have are 2015, at which point there were 4 times the number of EU nationals in the UK getting benefits as there were UK citizens in Europe receiving any kind of benefits. But the numbers since then have exploded.
Yep, and so since then, the number of EU nationals in the UK claiming welfare has increased sevenfold. Sevenfold. So the facts on the ground have changed. And therefore, look, we have a choice here. Either you have a government, which we've had now for years, that throws their hands up in the air and say numbers like, for example, foreign nationals claiming universal credit, that was 950,000 about 3.5 years ago. 3.5 years ago. That number is now 1.3 million. That's 350,000 more foreign nationals claiming universal credit in this country. That's happened in 3.5 years. So you tell me this, are we supposed to just stand by and allow that get to 2 million, 2.5 million, 3 million? Or are we actually going to say, sorry, we actually need to renegotiate this because this is patently unfair?
Well, I think the whole relationship with the European Union needs renegotiating. It appears that the Starmer approach is surrender, 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 starting with our fisheries, starting to make contributions again. The whole thing is mad. It is most certainly not what people voted for. And they were very, very clear. Labour in the general election were very, very clear there'd be no backturns at all on our relationship with the EU, and there've been several already. But look, the relationship clearly on this, and given the explosion of numbers, the relationship is hopelessly out of kilter. We'd like to negotiate something with the EU to show we're good neighbours on a reciprocal and fair basis. Jack Carson, next up from GB News.
What impact do you expect the increase in the NHS surcharge to have on waiting times? And is that money, is that ever going to be reinvested into public services, or is that only ever going to be a saving for the public purse? And just on the Home Secretary's announcements yesterday, do you think that they will stop the boats?
Look, I thought that what the Home Secretary said yesterday in rhetorical terms was extremely encouraging. Extremely encouraging. It's just that in realistic terms, I'm not quite sure that it will survive her own backbenches and a vote in Parliament, and I can't see that any of it actually works. You can tell the judges, please interpret the ECHR and the Human Rights Act differently, but in practice, you can't actually make them do that, given the current group that we've got. So, frankly, I don't actually think that most of what she said will make any difference at all. And as for the gimmick, we're going to take away people's watches and earrings. And this is just never going to happen. And even in Denmark, which of course is what they were citing, even in Denmark, I think only 17 people have had valuables removed from them. And by the way, Denmark too, now beginning to struggle with its own policies directly as a result of the European Court of Human Rights. So look, rhetorically, fine, following very many of the things that we've been saying for some years, but in practice, I doubt much of it will actually happen.
Yeah, and on your question regarding the NHS, look, we've made this press conference, and our proposals are to plug the current fiscal black hole that Rachel Reeves has created so that it is not necessary for her to raise taxes on British people. With regards specifically to the NHS surcharge, you actually read that impact assessment. The changes we're proposing would not have that meaningful delta on demand. Even if it did, frankly, there's far too much immigration in this country.
Yeah, thank you. Jasmine Cameron Chilesh, ITV News.
Thank you. Jasmine Cameron Chileshi, ITV News. You say these cuts will raise around £25 billion. Is it your expectation that if they go ahead, a reform government wouldn't have to increase taxes such as national insurance or income tax? And just secondly, if I may, the Home Secretary has urged you, Mr Farage, to, quote, sod off after you suggested she was auditioning to join Reform. What's your response? And just to confirm, would Reform MPs vote with the government on their asylum changes if needed?
Yeah, I did notice, actually, Robert Peston arriving in the room just as we started. Well, she seems to quite like using bad language, doesn't she, the Home Secretary? There's been quite a bit of it over the course of the last 48 hours or so. I mean, look, for her to say she's not in the least bit interested in what Reform has to say is clearly utter rot. They're obsessed with what Reform has to say. Just look at every Prime Minister's questions on a Wednesday and look at the Prime Minister or every other frontbencher that gets up in any single debate. And if Reform didn't exist, would she have made those announcements yesterday? No, she would not have done. In terms of the vote, and then I'll pass to Zia, in terms of how would we vote, well, in terms of the rhetoric, we support it. But in terms of the reality, why would we vote for something if we're convinced that it can't actually work? I also wonder, when will this actually come before Parliament in the form of primary legislation? Or is this just another, as we saw with Rishi's Stop the Boats, is it just another of one of these big performative exercises to say to the Red Wall audience, look, we're really with you. You don't need to go away and flirt with those ghastly reform types. When is this actually going to come before Parliament? Because there are many other things this government have promised that haven't yet made their way through primary legislation.
Yeah, and listen, I would just comment, my personal perspective on this is that it was Keir Starmer who accused Nigel of being racist, if you remember. And I put it to you that if Nigel Farage had sat at a press conference and announced that a reform government would start taking jewellery away from people coming across on small boats, Lord only knows what would have happened. And I take great exception to that, actually. I do take great exception to that. And I do also, one of the points about that particular policy is my view is clearly entirely performative. Because I don't know who they think is coming across by small boat. It's not 50 Cent and Lil Wayne. And so therefore, taking their gold chains away is not going to raise anything like enough money to make any dent on the asylum budget. But look, the savings that we have outlined here, as I said, we put them together carefully because they are things that Rachel Reeves can actually enact. Case in point being, for example, we have put in a 3-month notice period on the ending of universal credit payments. These are things, these are not fantasy, these are real things Rachel Reeves could choose to do. And as Nigel said, these are choices Labour is making.
Yes, and it's before. It's before. Just look at the graph, look at the trend, look at those that will get benefit rights over the course of the next 3 years and understand that the numbers we've talked about today will be significantly bigger by the end of this Parliament, which won't be in 2029. I'm pretty confident about that. Moving on, Tamara Cohen, Sky News.
Thank you, Tamara Cohen, Sky News. You're talking about finding these massive savings. Reform are in power in various councils. You promised massive savings then. They've struggled to find those savings, and many of them are looking at raising council tax. Why should voters feel reassured it'd be any different if you were in power nationally?
I did not make a single promise, not a single promise, in that election campaign that we'd be able to freeze or cut council tax. I never said it once. And do you know why? Because I realised the massive debts that we were inheriting from those county councils. It's such a shame. If you guys had focused on local government before the May the 1st elections, maybe the levels of debt would not have got as bad as they have. Now, of course, there's a huge focus on county councils up and down the country. Richard Tice laid out very clearly yesterday in a press conference the £330 million of savings we've already made. But he also made the bigger, broader point, which links actually directly into what we're talking about today, that there is a massive problem with the SEND budget, a massive, massive problem with the SEND budget. And this is going to need national government to work with local government to reduce those burdens. And it's a case of overdiagnosis, it's a case of misallocated budgets, it's a case of some of the most extraordinary expenditure. I mean, I wouldn't mind owning a taxi firm in Lincolnshire. It sounds like very good business. So there are a lot of the impact on those local councils does come from national government policy. Are we determined to make changes? Yes. Will we cut debt? Yes. But can we give people a free ticket at this moment in time on council tax? No. And I never, ever thought we would be able to at this stage. But I think the analogy that was given yesterday, if I listened carefully enough, was that we're 12 minutes into a 90-minute game. Did I get that right? Well, there you are. Marvellous. Let us move on to Martin Beckford from the Daily Mail.
Thank you. Just following on from Tamara's question. So will you be content if reform-led councils increase council tax by the maximum allowed 5% next year, or will you tell them they can't do that? Thank you.
Well, we can't tell them what to do. It's not, I mean, they are their own living, breathing organisms. I would very, very much hope that any council tax rises will be limited to inflation. That is very much my aim and aspiration for our councils. But I repeat the point. If you actually look at the numbers, we have inherited massive, massive debts. Massive debts. It isn't just at a national level that the country's in trouble. It's in big trouble at a local government level too. But I would just want to say one more thing, if I can, on this, and it is that last year 7 county councils had their elections cancelled in the name of local government reorganisation. This year, we understand, and in fact the Times I think have covered this better than any other newspaper, that the leaders of those Tory councils are urging the government to postpone the elections again because they're worried that reform might win them and oppose the local government reorganisation. I mean, imagine that. Imagine the democratic will of the people being discovered. So we would challenge very strongly the government and say, let's go ahead with the 7 county council elections. And by the way, part of that debate will be how we've run the other county councils. Let the public judge. So I would urge that very... Otherwise, you're going to have elected Conservative county councils who will, by the time this proposed local government reorganisation goes through, have actually sat in their positions for 7 years. And I think democratically that's unacceptable at any level. Martina Bett from The Sun.
Thank you very much. You want to cap foreign aid at 1 billion, but do you think that should come with conditions? For example, making every penny of that conditional on countries taking back illegal migrants, for example, and if they refuse, then they get nothing. And just quickly, on the confiscation scheme of jewellery and other assets, are you saying that you're against that?
It isn't going to happen in a month of Sundays. I'll bet you any money you like, we do not take a single possession of anybody, well, unless it's a gun, of anybody crossing the English Channel by dinghy. And as Zia says, if I dared to answer your question in the affirmative, I can't even imagine what some of the historic parallels that would be drawn and published would be. And that really gets to the heart of yesterday's event. It was performative to a very, very large degree. Even if she believes this stuff herself, and clearly she is very much more from the Blue Labour wing of the party, even if she believes it herself, it just isn't going to happen. Camilla Tominey from The Telegraph. Sorry.
Oh yeah, I'm happy to take that one. So we wouldn't even categorise. So listen, we want to hard cap foreign aid at £1 billion for the foreseeable, right? Until Britain's finances are in a position where hard-working bricklayers in this country are not being asked to pay ever more tax. In terms of making it conditional, well, what we would say, as we outlined in Operation Restoring Justice, our deportation plan, we allocated £2 billion specifically for paying foreign nations to take back their illegal migrants. So we wouldn't even call that foreign aid. That's very simple. You know, here's an incentive to take back your illegal migrants in our country so that we can basically ensure that we have proper immigration law here.
Yep. Camilla Tominey, Telegraph.
Morning, thank you. Camilla Tominey for the Daily Tea. Just a personnel question, mindful of the fact that you think there's going to be a general election in 2027, and you've been very critical of the current Chancellor. You've scrapped the tax cuts that Richard Tice wrote into the contract with the people at the last general election. If Zia Yusuf is now crunching the numbers for the announcements you're making today, should we presume that he's your preferred choice for Chancellor over Richard Tice now? Thank you.
Lovely try, but you should... No, it's very good. I mean, no wonder you're so well paid. But I'm just not playing your silly little game, sorry. Right, moving on to the next question. Max Kendix from The Times, who has covered the local government cancellations better than any other journalist.
Thank you. Couple of questions. One on, which was kind of asked before, but would be good to get addressed more fully. Is your aim to go into the next election making a promise not to raise any taxes whatsoever? Are there going to be solid commitments around that? Or conversely, do you think there's an area that should be taxed more? And Zia, I wonder, Shabana Mahmood said yesterday, when she was being accused of being divisive by a Lib Dem MP, that she's the one regularly called an effing P word and told to go back home. Is that an experience of racism in public life that you sympathise with?
Yeah, well, look, I've answered this a few times this morning on the morning round. So number one, I deeply sympathise with her for being in receipt of such appalling racism. That must be deeply unpleasant. And look, obviously different politicians have different reasons and motivations for saying and believing different things. I do somewhat take exception to this conflation with, or this association with, concern about immigration, legal and illegal, and racism. I do take exception to that because for, I think, decades now, and I've just been campaigning on this issue for decades, people in this country have voted time and time and time and time again for less immigration. Not because they're racist, not because they're running around shouting the F word or using the P word at people, but because they believe Britain should have borders, they believe in sovereignty, they believe in the rule of law, and they believe that if you pay taxes in this country, you should assume to actually get public services that make sense for you. So it's a subtle thing, and again, I have deep sympathy, of course, for anyone who receives that kind of racist abuse. Lord knows I've received abuse too, just like every frontline politician. But this notion that one should conflate concern about immigration, which, as she did in the chamber yesterday, with such appalling racism, I do have something of an issue with that.
Yeah, Melanie Phillips in your newspaper today makes some very similar points, actually, in a very powerful article. Look, we're a party that believes we need tax cuts, that the tax burden is too high, it's a disincentive. And by the way, I want lots of people moving back to Britain. I want people moving back to Britain who are going to pay lots and lots and lots of tax. Because if you drive away the wealthiest, you drive away the highest taxpayers, which means a potentially higher tax burden for everything else. But I think what we've shown you, or I believe what we've tried to show you over the course of the last few weeks, is that we fully understand that we can't even talk about tax cuts until we get our spiralling debt problem in this country under control. Equally, there needs to be a big change of culture as well when it comes to work, productivity, success, and maybe we should be championing entrepreneurs that do well and make money rather than portraying them as being evil for having done well. So there are some big cultural shifts that are needed as well. No, we want tax cuts. The tax burden is too high. We're committed to doing that, but first, we're showing you that we can make the cuts and do the things that will give us the room.
Can I just say one other thing on that? And it alludes to an earlier question as well, which is that I do think there's something of an underappreciation in the media about the changing financial situation since the last general election. And the country's finances have deteriorated meaningfully, even from the shambolic and deteriorated state they were in as a result of 14 years of Tory government. And if you were to look, and we can have this conversation again the day after the budget, but my assessment is, any reasonable assessment, assuming that Rachel Reeves does not do the things we're proposing here today, sadly, is that after the budget, just to unwind the incremental new taxes that Rachel Reeves has imposed on the British people, the mad inheritance tax changes, including on farmers, a 2% increase in national insurance contributions for employers, the sugar tax, all of these things she's talking about, will be north of £60 billion. And Lord knows we would love an early general election, but by the time we get to the next general election, in all likelihood, my view is that we're going to be at north of £100 billion just to unwind the appalling tax rises that Rachel Reeves would have implemented. So we've got to be straight up with the British people about that.
Absolutely. Jonathan Walker from The Express.
Thank you, Nigel. I think it was Zia this morning highlighted a web page that you've set up for people who are interested in defecting to reform. I don't suppose Shabana's really going to fill it in, but are you able to tell us anything about how many people have applied, and how do you decide who to accept and who to not accept?
In terms of defectors, I mean, the rule's very, very simple. We want people to come to us who we think will add to us, help us as a party, help us as a movement, as opposed to simply using us as a tool to revive their political careers. That's the criteria, plain and simple. Sophie Wingate from PA.
Thank you, Sophie Wingate from PA. On renegotiating with the EU on benefits for EU citizens, can you guarantee that it wouldn't lead to retaliatory measures and higher prices for British consumers? And have you had any exploratory talks with EU officials to see how open they might be?
No, I'm not terribly popular in Brussels most of the time, it has to be said. I think they're quite pleased to see the back of me in many ways, although the European Parliament's very, very dull now that the Brexit Party aren't there. It's a negotiation. You know, it's a negotiation, and you go into a negotiation with a very clear idea of what your objectives are and what your interests are. And your interests ought to be the national interest, and the whole disaster of the EU renegotiation from the very, very early days it was viewed by Theresa May and others as a damage limitation exercise as opposed to a rejuvenating opportunity. And so we finished up with a very bad deal that currently the Prime Minister is trying to make considerably worse. We will adopt a different approach, and you can never predict how negotiations will go, but I do think that we have a team of people who've been used to negotiations, who know what the tough side of life is when it comes to business, when it comes to putting together contracts, putting together deals, and I would argue we've got a far better chance of doing something in the national interest than any of the careerists that have gone before us. Maurizio Alencar, City AM.
Hi, Maurizio Alencar, CCM. Thank you. Some of the criticism of Labour has been on plans to create a so-called smorgasbord of tax rises based on quite volatile items. But then this package is also talking about some volatile items such as net migration. So, you know, is this savings package and slight surcharge fees package also not based on very sort of unpredictable forecasts? Thanks.
No. Just have a look at the graph. I mean, you're City AM, for goodness sake. Just have a look at the trend. The trends have now been well established for several years, and actually the numbers are getting worse, and the predictions for those numbers, whether it's PIP, whether it's universal credit, all of this will be considerably worse this time next year, and even worse the year after that. The trend is very, very clear, and this is about arresting and turning around that trend.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, the only number that could in any way be described as being reliant on a variable is the one on IHS that you flagged, the immigration health surcharge. The $5 billion number we just touted as being the saving is based on the current OBR forecast for net immigration. But I also said in my speech, because we've done the numbers on this, if they cut net immigration to zero, which is what our policy is, it would still save north of 3 billion quid. So that's still 23 billion pounds, more than enough to negate tax rises.
Emilio Casaliccio from Politico.
Hi, thank you very much, Emilio. You say that you made no specific promises about council tax before those May elections, but reform local groups did make very clear promises. So what will you do to keep better control over what these people promise on essentially your behalf in local areas? And are you able to say something just a bit more in general about that experience, what councils, these reform councils are finding, the challenges that they're finding in terms of saving money or in terms of making difficult decisions for savings that actually are proving very unpopular or the government won't let them do? What have you learned from this experience of some form of governance about what you should be promising ahead of the election and how a reform government might need to kind of temper expectations?
I was incredibly careful in the run-up to those county elections not to make false economic promises. And I promise you, you will not find a leaflet officially sanctioned by the party. You will not find a clip or an excerpt of anything I said on the street or on camera or to you or wherever it may be where I made any false claims about tax and council tax. And I can assure you, having travelled and having met, I can't even think, but probably 800 to 900 of the 1,300 people that stood, 600 people that stood for us, I didn't hear anyone making false promises on council tax. So I think, you know, the messages that were coming from the central party through the senior membership team were very, very loud and clear. Lessons, yeah, I mean, I think, you know, getting anything to change in this country is difficult. It's difficult because of inertia. It's difficult because of the status quo. It's difficult because there are plenty of people living in the marzipan layer, you know, on a public sector with the promise of great pensions, with maybe not the longest working hours in the world, many of them thinking since the pandemic that actually work from home was a suitable alternative. Yeah, getting things to change is hard. I think that's perhaps the biggest thing that I take from these first few months. And that is to a very large extent why, it's getting back to the Express question really, that's very much why Danny Kruger has come into the party to oversee a team, to think, how are we going to deal with those challenges with Whitehall and elsewhere? But yeah, that's my big takeout. Okay, we're rattling through. Will Hazel from the iPaper.
Thank you. Do you support Shabana Mahmood's plan to deport the children of failed asylum seekers? Because I think earlier in the year, Reform rode back on plans to deport the children of illegal migrants in your mass deportation plan.
Look, you know, my job is not to make your life easier. And so I'm going to say this. The absolute priority with deporting those who've come illegal are young, undocumented males of fighting age, many of whom will do great harm in this country to women, to girls, join crime gangs, and that is the absolute priority, and that remains my answer. Lucy White from Bloomberg.
Thank you. I wanted to ask about steel. At the moment, the EU has proposed much higher tariffs on steel that we are trying to negotiate our way out of. If you were to torpedo relations with the EU by, for example, withdrawing from the ECHR or by treating their citizens here differently to the way we treat our own, how do you expect that to impact on these industries that are so reliant on our relations to the EU? Because the steel industry has said the tariffs at the current level that the EU is proposing would be incredibly damaging.
No, and I understand that, but that's all part of a negotiation, isn't it? That's all part of a negotiation. And, you know, when you're negotiating against someone that sees weakness, they will keep hammering you. You know, that is the world that we live in. And we've shown weakness since 2016. Time after time after time. And frankly, under Keir Starmer's leadership, it is craven weakness that we're seeing on fishing and everything else. So yes, these are issues, as are trade issues around the whole of the rest of the world. But this is about a complete reset of our relationship, and one that is